In the spring of 1946, Texarkana was a town caught between two states, a quiet town where the war's end brought the illusion of peace, but beneath the surface of darkness had begun to stir. The streets were calm, the schools and factories functioning as they always had, the air carrying the scent of pine and mud, but the calm was fragile, easily shattered by shadows that moved in ways no one could predict. The first attacks came without warning, striking ordinary young couples who sought moments of privacy in the fields and back roads outside the town. The attacker was methodical, appearing without sound or pattern, vanishing before anyone could register the threat. The first victims were found bruised, terrified, their escape narrow and uncertain, leaving behind only the memory of a figure wearing a crude white mask with eye holes that seemed to stare through their souls. The town reacted with disbelief and growing unease, authorities inspecting the roads and the fields, trying to find footprints or clues, but the figure left nothing. In the following weeks, more couples fell victim to the same silent predator, each attack reinforcing the legend that was quickly forming in whispers across the community. The attacker struck at night, choosing locations carefully, often remote stretches where the moonlight barely illuminated the road, ensuring there were no witnesses. The method was consistent but unpredictable in timing, creating a pervasive tension that gripped Texarkana like a cold hand. Families barred doors, parents kept children indoors, lights blazed on porches where darkness once held sway, and gun shops sold out of rifles and pistols to citizens desperate for protection. Law enforcement patrolled every road, but the figure remained elusive, moving through the landscape with knowledge that suggested intimate familiarity with every back road, every shadow ditch, every abandoned farmhouse. The first victim survived, leaving accounts of a man whose presence was almost unreal, his movements deliberate yet silent, striking with precision, his targets unaware until it was too late. The injuries inflicted were often blunt, sometimes with a firearm, always designed to terrorize, demonstrating a cold intelligence and a lack of remorse. As the number of attacks increased, the town's atmosphere transformed from ordinary calm to a state of siege. Every evening brought anxiety, every shadow carried the weight of a possible attack, and the townspeople began to whisper of a phantom, a ghost that walked among them in the night, striking at will, leaving only fear behind. Newspapers reported the events cautiously, careful to avoid panic, yet the headlines could not contain the dread that grew with each new assault. Investigators from both Texas and Arkansas convened, exchanging reports and attempting to establish patterns, but the attacker remained inscrutable. There were no clear motives, no robbery, no signs of grudges. The attacks were entirely targeted at couples, young men, and women alone in their cars or walking in secluded areas, as if the perpetrator sought only to create terror, to dominate the night itself. The figure became known as the Phantom, a presence both terrifying and invisible, whose methods were precise, whose timing was unpredictable, and whose very existence challenged the town's sense of safety. Residents altered their routines, businesses operated under a shadow of anxiety, and the once bright nights were now filled with whispers and fear. The attacks escalated, each one more brazen, demonstrating a calculated cruelty that seemed almost ritualistic in its execution. The attacker selected victims with apparent randomness, yet with intimate knowledge of the town's geography, appearing where escape was difficult, vanishing without trace, leaving only terror in his wake. As spring turned to early summer, Texarkana was gripped by panic, its citizens watching shadows, counting steps, and fearing every footfall on their porches. The figure of the Phantom was no longer a rumor, it was a palpable presence, stalking the roads, fields, and forests, a symbol of the fragility of safety and the omnipresence of fear. Law enforcement's frustration grew as the list of victims mounted, the attacker remaining unseen, his identity unknown, his motives opaque, and his methods precise and untraceable. The town, once ordinary and peaceful, was now defined by anxiety, by the relentless tension that followed the Phantom from road to road, from victim to victim. Each new attack magnified the horror, each discovery deepening the collective dread, until the figure became legendary in its terror, a presence whose shadow loomed over every corner of Texarkana, and whose existence transformed the town into a place where the night itself was dangerous, where the ordinary had been replaced by a pervasive, invisible menace. The Phantom's presence in Texarkana evolved from whispered fear to a tangible, inescapable threat. Each night became a gauntlet, each road a trap, and the town's routine dissolved under the weight of uncertainty. The figure was not a clumsy predator, every movement was calculated, every appearance deliberate. He studied the patterns of the town, observing from the woods, the fields, the shadows behind barns and abandoned buildings, learning the habits of his victims, noting the isolated roads and the times when couples ventured out in relative privacy. No detail escaped him. The attack sites were chosen with precision, the environment manipulated to maximize vulnerability. Fields with tall grass, secluded back roads, corners of the city where light was sparse, these became hunting grounds where he moved like a ghost. The townspeople began to recognize patterns only in hindsight, but the phantom always stayed one step ahead, invisible and unknowable. Victims were ordinary young men and women, strangers to him, yet carefully selected for their isolation and the impossibility of immediate assistance. His first successful attacks had demonstrated his ability to control the environment and manipulate fear. The injuries inflicted were meant to terrorize as much as to physically incapacitate, creating a psychological imprint that persisted long after the night ended. He was patient, waiting for moments when the couple was distracted or unaware, emerging suddenly to confront them with an inevitability that left no room for negotiation. He was silent, moving without rustle, using the darkness as a cloak, blending into the night so completely that even officers patrolling the area could not detect him. The phantom's method was meticulous. He observed the target from a distance, noting the vehicle type, the approximate time of departure, the route likely to be taken, and any environmental variables that could hinder or aid his approach. Once satisfied, he would position himself where he could strike with maximum control and minimal risk. Often, he attacked from multiple angles, using terrain to obscure his presence, ensuring that victims had no chance of escape. His timing was precise. The attacks often happened late at night, during hours when isolation was greatest and witnesses were absent. Each assault reinforced the legend of the figure in the mask, each survivor or discovery of a body adding layers to the terror. Law enforcement struggled to respond. Officers walked the roads, inspected every dirt path and wooded edge, yet the phantom always eluded them. Investigators noted his ability to vanish without leaving traces. There were no tire marks that could confirm his route, no footprints in soft earth that might betray him, no discarded clothing or personal effects to trace. The phantom was a master of concealment, moving through the landscape with the confidence of one who belonged to it entirely. He was patient, adaptive, and untraceable. Patterns were studied, yet attempts to predict his next move failed repeatedly. Texarkana itself transformed under the weight of fear. Families barred doors, neighborhoods became silent after dusk, citizens avoided the roads entirely, knowing that any movement in isolation could attract the phantom's attention. The town's rhythm shifted, businesses altered hours, schools adjusted schedules, and gatherings were curtailed. Paranoia spread as the attacks continued, every shadow suspect, every sound potentially a precursor to violence. Citizens carried weapons, modified routines, and even avoided intimate interactions in public spaces, aware that the phantom targeted young couples in isolation. As spring gave way to summer, the number of attacks increased. Each new incident revealed more of the phantom's intelligence and planning. He targeted those who were most vulnerable, yet without overt pattern to location or exact timing, ensuring that unpredictability fueled anxiety. He struck in places once considered safe, changing routes, exploiting knowledge of the terrain, often reappearing where police or local residents assumed he could not. Some nights, bodies were discovered hours later, arranged in a manner suggesting the phantom took care to leave a psychological impression, a signature of control and domination. The victims themselves became figures in the town's collective fear. Young couples seeking private moments found themselves trapped by a figure who seemed omnipresent yet unseen. Physical injury was secondary to the terror he instilled. Survivors carried trauma visible in their eyes, the tremor in their steps, the inability to sleep without fear of footsteps outside. Each new story reinforced the mythos of the phantom, a man who was less a criminal than a force that reshaped the perception of safety in Texarkana. The attacks were no longer isolated crimes, they became events that defined every night, every movement, and every decision in the town. The phantom's adaptability was notable. He changed tactics according to circumstance, sometimes appearing near vehicles, sometimes approaching on foot through open fields, other times using elevated vantage points to observe targets from a distance before descending into action. His mobility was aided by an intimate knowledge of backroads, shortcuts, and hidden paths, allowing him to strike and vanish before police or neighbors could respond. Witnesses reported fleeting glimpses of the mask, of a figure moving like a shadow, reinforcing the idea that he was not bound by the ordinary limitations of a man. Fear of capture never slowed him. Each successful attack emboldened him further, increasing his control over the night and the town's psyche. Authorities intensified efforts, pooling resources from both Texas and Arkansas, yet each investigation yielded frustration. Patrols were increased, coordinated watches established, yet the phantom struck regardless. His intelligence seemed to anticipate law enforcement actions. Every attempt to trap or confront him failed. Investigators could only document the aftermath, recording patterns of disappearance, injury, or death, building profiles based on the minimal evidence left behind. The phantom remained undetectable, untouchable, a spectre operating within the framework of the town's geography, exploiting familiarity and fear. Texarkana's social fabric frayed under the strain. Public spaces emptied, homes became fortified, and a sense of communal anxiety grew. Citizens modified routines, avoiding travel after dark, warning friends and family against isolation, and living in a heightened state of alert. The town became an environment shaped by fear, where every shadow might conceal the phantom, and every quiet night held the possibility of attack. Psychological terror was as potent as physical violence. The community learned to live under constant tension, aware that the unseen figure could strike anywhere, anytime. By midsummer, the attacks had created a climate of widespread paranoia and relentless vigilance. Survivors bore the lasting impression of the phantom's calculated brutality, and each body found reinforced the narrative of an attacker who was strategic, patient, and remorseless. Law enforcement chronicled the events meticulously, yet all efforts to capture the perpetrator failed. The phantom's methods, his timing, his knowledge of terrain, and his ability to vanish into the night ensured he remained untouchable, an enduring symbol of fear and control. Texarkana existed in the shadow of a predator who had rewritten the rules of safety and survival, whose actions defined the collective consciousness of the town, and whose presence, though unseen, was felt in every heartbeat and every footstep across the quiet streets. The phantom's reign of terror continued through the summer, unrelenting and invisible. He claimed victims not for revenge, not for gain, but seemingly for the dominion over fear itself. Each attack served as a reminder that control could be absolute, that invisibility could empower violence, and that the night belonged to him. The town was transformed. Its innocence stripped away, its citizens forever altered by the knowledge that a single figure could dominate space and psychology with skill, patience, and ruthlessness. Texarkana became a crucible of fear, its streets and fields marked not by footprints, but by the lingering presence of the unseen, the calculated, and the deadly. The phantom existed as both predator and symbol, an enigma whose attacks reshaped the town and whose shadow stretched far beyond the immediate victims, embedding itself into the history and psyche of Texarkana forever. Texarkana, by the summer of 1946, was no longer a town defined by everyday routines or ordinary fears. The phantom had transformed the landscape into a theater of dread, where every road, field, and shadow became a potential trap. The city's pulse quickened not from life, but from anticipation, as citizens measured every movement against the possibility of encountering a predator who moved unseen, striking with precision and disappearing without trace. The attacks had evolved from isolated incidents into a sustained campaign, each act more calculated and terrifying than the last. The phantom displayed an understanding of human psychology as keen as his knowledge of terrain. He selected victims with meticulous attention, not at random, but with the purpose of amplifying fear. Couples in remote areas were ideal young men and women alone, vulnerable, and unaware of the patterns that would draw them into his presence. The assaults were executed with methodical precision. The phantom studied the environment, noting the position of the moon, the cover of trees, the placement of vehicles, and the likely reactions of his victims. He observed, waited, and struck at the exact moment when resistance or escape was least possible. His attacks combined physical control with psychological terror, ensuring that those targeted felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability, as if the night itself conspired against them. The injuries inflicted were not merely violent, they were deliberate instruments of fear, signaling the reach and capability of a predator who could operate beyond detection. By the time authorities arrived, he was already gone, leaving only the aftermath, the witness's terror, and the inescapable feeling that he had dominated the entire night. Each victim's encounter with the phantom left a profound imprint on the town's collective consciousness. Stories of survival circulated, fragmented and terrifying, painting a picture of a man who could appear anywhere, at any time, and whose movements were invisible until the moment of action. Survivors described the suddenness of his presence, the efficiency of his approach, and the intensity of fear that consumed them. Those who did not survive became symbols of vulnerability and mortality, their deaths reinforcing the community's understanding that no location offered true safety. The phantom's ability to vanish into darkness, leaving no traces of entry or exit, compounded the town's terror and the law enforcement's frustration. The attacks escalated as summer deepened, with the Phantom growing bolder, striking more frequently and with increasing control over his environment. Fields that had been considered safe were penetrated, roads once avoided became sites of horror, and even areas near the town center were no longer exempt from his presence. Each attack reinforced the idea that he could select and manipulate any situation, exploiting weaknesses in both human behavior and the physical landscape. The townspeople's lives were dominated by the anticipation of danger, the psychological weight of knowing that the predator could appear at any moment. This fear was pervasive, infiltrating homes, workplaces, and public spaces, altering routines and relationships, and instilling a communal sense of vulnerability. Law enforcement agencies intensified efforts, deploying additional officers, coordinating patrols across state lines, and analyzing patterns in the attacks. Yet each plan was met with failure. The Phantom seemed to anticipate their movements, adapting his methods, shifting locations, and exploiting knowledge of both the natural and urban environment. His attacks were characterized by timing, precision, and concealment, combining an understanding of geography with a deep psychological awareness of his victims' behavior. Investigators found no consistent physical evidence. Footprints, tire tracks, discarded clothing, or other forensic traces were absent. The Phantom was untraceable, a figure who existed only in the aftermath, whose presence was defined by the terror left behind rather than by tangible clues. Texarkana's social structure became increasingly defined by fear. Public gatherings diminished, streets emptied after dusk, and families imposed strict controls on daily activities. Business operations adjusted to accommodate curfews, schools implemented early closures, and citizens traveled in pairs or groups whenever possible. The Phantom's influence extended beyond his immediate victims, shaping the entire community's behavior. Psychological trauma spread through the population, affecting both adults and children, instilling hypervigilance, mistrust, and a persistent sense of exposure to danger. Each new attack reaffirmed the town's vulnerability and reinforced the belief that the Phantom's control over the night was absolute. The attacks were diverse in execution, demonstrating both adaptability and intelligence. The Phantom could approach on foot through open fields, conceal himself in dense foliage, or position himself along roadways to exploit the element of surprise. He was mobile, using knowledge of shortcuts, back roads, and terrain features to strike and vanish before detection. His presence was often fleeting, perceived only in glimpses or through the aftermath of violence. Each assault was designed not only to harm but to assert dominance over the town, creating an environment in which fear was as palpable as any physical barrier. The impact on victims was profound. Survivors displayed lasting trauma, characterized by sleep disturbances, heightened anxiety, and an enduring fear of darkness and isolation. Those who did not survive became markers of the Phantom's lethal efficiency, and their deaths served to heighten communal anxiety. The selection of victims, primarily couples in isolated locations, reinforced a narrative of unpredictability and omnipresence, making it impossible for residents to feel secure even in familiar areas. The Phantom's strategy emphasized both physical and psychological control, ensuring that his influence extended far beyond direct encounters with victims. As the summer progressed, the scale of terror reached a peak. The Phantom's ability to manipulate timing, terrain, and perception allowed him to orchestrate attacks with precision and minimal risk to himself. He exploited knowledge of law enforcement procedures, human behavior, and environmental factors to maintain a persistent advantage. The town, in turn, responded with heightened vigilance, yet no combination of patrols, watches, or community action succeeded in deterring or capturing him. The cumulative effect of these attacks was a pervasive state of fear that defined Texarkana's nights and colored its days, shaping perceptions of safety and vulnerability for every resident. The psychological dominance exerted by the Phantom became as significant as the physical consequences of his actions. The absence of resolution, the inability to identify or apprehend him, and the randomness of his attacks created a sense of omnipresence that permeated the town. Citizens adapted their lives around potential encounters, altering routines, avoiding certain locations, and living under a continuous awareness of threat. The social fabric was stretched, trust eroded, and collective anxiety intensified, creating an environment in which fear itself was weaponized. The Phantom's reign of terror exemplified an understanding of human psychology and environmental control. He combined patience, observation, and strategic execution to maximize impact while minimizing risk. His attacks were carefully planned, executed with precision, and characterized by an invisibility that left law enforcement without leads. The combination of physical aggression, psychological manipulation, and tactical intelligence ensured that his presence would remain a defining feature of Texarkana's history, shaping the community's experience and leaving a legacy of terror that would persist long after the immediate events. Texarkana, by the end of summer, existed in a state of suspended anxiety. Each night brought the possibility of attack, each shadow was suspect, and every movement carried the weight of potential confrontation. The Phantom had imposed an invisible dominion over the town, exploiting fear as effectively as any weapon. His identity remained unknown, his methods untraceable, and his influence absolute. Citizens were forever altered, not only by the immediate physical danger but by the enduring psychological imprint left by a predator whose presence was defined by strategy, stealth, and the power to dominate without ever being seen. By the fall of 1946, the town of Texarkana had been transformed irrevocably. The streets that had once echoed with the ordinary rhythms of daily life were now silent at night, each corner and pathway shadowed by the memory of the Phantom's attacks. The figure that had emerged from darkness and fear had become a force beyond mere criminality, a presence that dominated the collective consciousness of the community. Law enforcement continued to patrol, investigate, and analyze, but the figure remained unseen, untouchable, and enigmatic. Patterns were recorded, evidence compiled, but every lead dissolved into nothingness. The Phantom's methods were beyond conventional detection. His ability to strike and vanish had turned him into a specter, a myth made flesh, whose influence persisted even in his absence. The psychological impact on Texarkana was profound. Residents lived under a persistent awareness of threat, and ordinary behaviors were reshaped by the anticipation of violence. Families installed locks, lights blazed through the night, and travel after dark was minimized. Children were shielded, social gatherings curtailed, and community routines restructured around fear. The Phantom had weaponized invisibility, using the unseen as effectively as the visible, creating a climate in which every shadow suggested danger and every night felt perilous. The town had internalized the predator's tactics, adjusting behavior as if in response to an omnipresent threat, the consequences of which extended far beyond the physical injuries inflicted during his attacks. Despite the intensity of law enforcement efforts, the Phantom's identity remained unknown. Suspects were interrogated, sightings documented, and profiles created, yet none yielded conclusive results. The man who had terrorized Texarkana had exploited both geography and psychology with exceptional skill, blending into the environment, disappearing without trace, and leaving the community in perpetual suspense. His methods emphasized patience, observation, and the manipulation of fear, demonstrating a level of strategic intelligence that elevated him from ordinary criminality to a figure of legend. Every attack, every disappearance, every scar left on the town's psyche reinforced the idea that the Phantom operated with a mastery of both human behavior and the landscape, existing as a presence that could not be contained or controlled. The legacy of the Phantom extended beyond the immediate victims. Survivors carried trauma that affected their ability to sleep, their perceptions of safety, and their daily interactions. Families bore the burden of anxiety and hypervigilance, while the community collectively experienced the erosion of trust and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The unknown nature of the predator amplified the psychological effect, transforming fear into a tool that controlled movement, behavior, and perception. Texarkana became a town defined by its response to an invisible adversary, the boundaries of safety redrawn by a figure whose existence challenged conventional understanding of threat. In the years that followed, the Phantom's attacks ceased, but the enigma remained. The absence of resolution left questions unanswered and fostered enduring speculation. Residents shared memories and warnings, documenting the terror that had unfolded, ensuring that the figure's presence was etched into local history. The town continued to grapple with the aftereffects, balancing the return of ordinary life with the enduring awareness that one individual had once exerted near total control over their nights and fears. The Phantom, though no longer active, remained a symbol of invisible power, a demonstration of the influence of fear and the fragility of perceived safety. The legend of the Phantom Killer extended beyond Texarkana, capturing the attention of media, law enforcement, and public imagination. Newspapers recounted the attacks with caution and detail, emphasizing the extraordinary skill, patience, and elusiveness of the figure. His story became part of the broader narrative of American criminal history, a case study in the intersection of strategy, violence, and psychological control. Unlike many crimes that are resolved, the Phantom's identity, motives, and ultimate fate remained obscured, cementing his status as a mythic figure whose presence defined an era of terror for those who experienced it firsthand. Texarkana itself endured, shaped by memory and vigilance. Streets, once ordinary, were marked by caution and stories of the past. Citizens learned to navigate an environment where the unseen could dominate experience, where behavior was adapted to avoid potential danger, and where the psychological imprint of an unknown predator persisted. The Phantom's influence had transformed the town, embedding itself into local consciousness and leaving a legacy that transcended the immediate effects of violence. Fear had become structural, behavioral, and communal, and the lessons of those months shaped responses to threat long after the events had ended. The Phantom Killer's story stands as a testament to the power of invisibility, strategy, and terror. It illustrates how a single figure, operating with patience, intelligence, and ruthless precision, can reshape a community's understanding of safety and control. Though the attack ceased, the lessons endured. That fear can be wielded as effectively as weapons, that knowledge of human behavior can amplify power, and that some presences leave marks that no passage of time can erase. Texarkana, forever altered, retained the memory of the nights dominated by an unseen predator, and the legend of the Phantom Killer endured, a chilling reminder of how a shadow can command the world of the living without ever being seen. Dear friends, stay with us on our channel. Subscribe, hit the bell, and don't miss out. There's so much exciting content waiting for you.